So, good evening, guys. And once again, we are back with day 9 of this initiative of Civils Daily called Daily Answer Wars and Daily Answer Wars Prime. So, again, in the morning session, we had given you a question in the Telegram group. It was a PYQ for this year only related to GS2. As you all know, we are trying to cover some PYQs in the recent past. We will try to cover all the GS papers, not all questions, but most of the questions that are important and that can be based on those themes. Question can again be asked in this main. So, such questions we are picking out from the PYQs and trying to cover them. So again, in the morning session, the question was related to vulnerable sections. So this is an important part in social justice and governance topic of GS2. And I must say that not only the question that was given today, but more topics regarding to vulnerable sections should be prepared by you guys. Mostly like topics related to women, children, or transgenders. So all of these topics are important, and any of them can be asked in the social justice section of paper 2. So the question today was the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 remains only a legal document without intense sensitization of government functionaries and citizens regarding disability. So you had to comment on this and it was a 10 markers. So the word limit was, as you know, 150 words. So in this question, it was a very, I will say, like moderate level difficulty question. One thing that you had to know was some provisions of rights of persons with disabilities act, PwD Act 2016. If you knew some of the provisions of this act, it could have been an advantage in this question, because you needed to mention at least some of the provisions so that you can also again mention what are the lacuna or what are the problems that we are facing. The second part was the question was comparatively easier because in the question itself, a trick to the answer was given. So the question says that it remains only a legal document. So you had to emphasize on why it remains a legal document. Now the answer to this thing was also given in the question itself, that intense sensitization of government functionaries and citizens is lacking. So without intense sensitization of government functionaries and citizens, this act remains a legal document only. So you had to just expand on these two things, that is sensitization of government functionaries and sensitization of citizens. So what are the problems in these particular aspects that lead to the act just being a legal document? So you had just to elaborate, or I will say, of this act. So that was the criticism or the challenges part. Next, you had to mention a very short way forward, because this is an open-ended question, and a way forward will be accepted, will be expected, because this act is a very important act regarding to persons with disabilities, and as a policy maker in the future, you need to analyze or understand that what all we can do more to empower this section, that is the section with disabilities in India. So basic way forward was required. Again, you need not go into a lot of details, as this was just a 10 marker. So you had to mention all of these things in the word limit given. So that was the challenge again. So first you had to write a basic introduction. Then you had to go on talking about the some of the features of that. Again, you need not mention all the features. Just most important 2-3 features were good enough. After that, you can just mention the problems with this act, why it remains a legal document, and then you could have gone for a very short brief way forward, and finally you could have concluded this answer. So this was the basic framework of this question. In the course of this session, we will see what all we could have written in each of these parts, and after that we will also look at some of the copies that you have submitted in the Telegram group and understand that what where we are lacking and what all we could have done more to improve our answers. So, good evening, Varsha. Good evening, Sweta. Good evening, Nishant. Good evening, Harji. So, let us start with the introduction part. So, in the introduction, you could have just given a data point about persons with disabilities in India. So, according to this census 2011, in India, 2.68 crore persons are disabled, of which 56% are males and 44% are females. Now, you might ask that so much of data is very tough to remember. So, what you could have just done is, like, you could have mentioned this round figure, 2.2%, or just 2% of the total population in India are disabled according to census 2011. And I think that should have been a decent enough introducing statement that also emphasizes upon the need of this act. So after this, I have just tried to link it with PwD Act. That is, in this regard, the government came up with Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 to provide basic rights to the disabled. So just ensure that you are mentioning something about this data. All of what I have mentioned is not necessary, but just try to mention at least 2% of the total population according to Census 2011. And some of you were also asking about how to remember these facts. So during the course of this session, there are many facts that I provide in these answers. So what you can do is also note down these facts and compile them at one place. So divide your fact, make a fact sheet and divide it into parts. For example, for GS1, GS2, GS3, GS4 does not require so much of facts. So GS1 to 3, in place of facts for GS4, you can create a compilation of some general quotes which are useful in answering GS4 questions. For the rest 3 GS papers, according to the topics, just jot down the syllabus topic name, broad subheading, and then jot down 3 4 facts which are a bit universal, which you can use like in almost every paper. You can just interchange the papers and also use those facts. So try to do that. If you start from today also, I think during the course of till the time the mains will happen, I think you will have collected enough facts so that your data part or the content about facts is complete. So don't worry about that. If you just keep being consistent, and even if you note 1 or 2 facts every day, I think that should be sufficient enough compilation of facts. Just be sure that you note down the facts in an easy to remember format. For example, here you need not note all the details, just the broad percentage and the broad data is sufficient. So that was about the introduction. Next, we move on to the features of this act. So again, I have given 5 points here. So you can just curtail it to 2 3 points if you did not remember that properly. But I think some of the provisions were quite in use and quite prominent, which you must have, which everyone who was writing this paper must have gone through, because it was in the editorials and all. For example, this increase in reservation, this was a very important point, and most of the newspapers and magazines which we read had this point, that it increases the quantum of reservation for people suffering from disabilities from 3% to 4% in government jobs and from 3% to 5% in higher education institutes. Next, you can also talk about the types of disabilities. So, earlier, before this act, only 7 types of disabilities were considered disabilities. So, after this act, that number was increased to 21. And also, this act provided the central government the power to add more disabilities if the need arises. So, you can talk about this, that the number of disabilities increased, 21 types, including mental disabilities and physical disabilities, were covered in this act. Next, we can also talk about the free education part. So, according to this act, all the disabled children between 6 to, or the differently abled children between 6 to 18 years shall have the right to free education. So, this was also an important point which you could have mentioned. Now, if you don't remember the data and all, you can also talk about this Accessible India campaign. This was also called as Sugamya Bharat in Hindi. So, Accessible India campaign is the stress has been given to ensure accessibility in public buildings in a prescribed time frame along with Accessible India campaign. So this basically involved the like construction of ramps and wheelchairs, provision of wheelchairs and all for the disabled people, so that they can access the government services in a better way, or they do not face problems in accessing those services. So you can talk about this. And after that, an implementation mechanism was also instituted in the act. So the chief commissioner for persons with disabilities and the state commissioners were mandated to act as regulatory bodies. And there was also a provision of grievance redressal, which these very people were mandated to address. So, and they were also in charge of monitoring the implementation of this act. So you can talk about this, but it is not necessary to mention all the points, because I understand that it is very tough to remember all these things in the exam hall under that pressure. So if you just mention the first 3 4 points that I have talked about here, I think it was good to go. And the first 3 4 points were quite easy also. So after that, as I said, you can just go on to talk about why it remains only a legal document. So in this again, I just told you that you can just elaborate or expand these points. That is why what are the lacuna that the government functionaries, or the why government functionaries are lacking, and where citizens are lacking. So both these points, both these sections could have been written. So for the content part, you can just talk about one of the most important things about this act is that many states have not notified the state rules. Now this is a central government act. After this, the rules are were mandated to be notified by the states respectively. but across 24 states, I guess only 10 or 11 states have notified these state rules. So you can talk about this that most of the states have not notified the rules. Next, there is also a provision to provide assistive devices to the disabled people, but on the due to the lack of like sensitization of government functionaries, only 5 to 15% of people who require assistive devices and technologies have access to them. So this is basically because many of the government functionaries refuse to recognize people as disabled, like they do not care about them, and they just are very procrastinate on giving certificates and all, and that leads to their like non-availability of devices for them. So you can talk about that. Also, there is a component of charges, so that is also an issue for disabled people, because you must understand that poverty and disability are quite linked. So most of the disabled people are poor, not all, but most of them are poor, and actually this is a cycle. So you can also talk about that, that both of these things are linked, and hence they do not get access to these assistive devices and technologies. Also, after that, you can, as I just mentioned, you can talk about lack of planning of certifying authority. So many of the disabled people are not being able to get certifications under this act, because the authorities often demand the person to be physically present, which is quite a challenge in the case of disabled people. You can also talk about policy barriers. It included lack of awareness or enforcement of existing laws, which are meant to ease the life of PWDs. After that, you can also talk about a Supreme Court case that was in news. However, this is pretty tough, I understand, to remember. But again, you can note this down and use it in your future answers. That Supreme Court in this case, that is like National Platform for the Rights of the Disabled versus Department of Empowerment for Persons with Disabilities and others. What Supreme Court ruled is that the government is quite insensitive while allocating services like IPS, IFS, foreign service, etc., to the disabled people. So even if you did not remember the case, you could have just mentioned this, and it would surely have given you some extra points or added as an innovative point which most of the people would have missed. So this was about the government citizens, government functionaries. After that, we go on to talk about the citizens. So again, here I have mentioned 4 5 points. You could have just shortened it, or what you could have done is used a smart art format. For example, you could have just drawn a hub spoke diagram or a flow chart, and then just mentioned the broad points, and I think that should have been sufficient enough. After that, we go on to talk about the sensitization of citizens. So this was quite an easy part, because most of us know the issues with the social issues with the disabled people. The first one is social and attitudinal issues. So stereotyping, like many people consider PWDs unhealthy because of their impairments. Thus, they have to face stigma, prejudice, and discrimination at multiple levels. So you can talk about this, that they face stigma, prejudice, and discrimination. Next, you can talk about accessibility. So again, like many private institutions where citizens are in charge, they do not construct or design their facilities according to the disabled, or do not give them the opportunity. So that is also an issue. So design and construction of indoor and outdoor facilities can prevent them from going to school and hospitals, shopping, etc. So this I've included in citizens just because this can also be done by private sector. So that is not the issue of for government to look after, but general public to look after. Next, we can talk about the communication challenges. So experienced by people who have disabilities that affect hearing, speaking, reading, writing, and or understanding. So most of the disabled people who have these like these vulnerabilities, that is hearing defects, speaking or reading defects, so they always face challenges in communication, and that pushes them a step again backwards. So you can talk about these things in the lack of sensitization of citizens. So broadly, this could have been your body part of the answer. Next, you could have just moved on to the way forward. Uh, Way forward again could have been derived just from these points that you have written, just how to overcome these things. So first and foremost is the overcoming of attitudinal changes, or the social and attitudinal aspect. So people need to be sensitized for supporting PWDs to live independent and dignified lives. So we can not people should be sensitized to not make fun of or make jokes at disabled people. So these changes should come from the society itself. No law can just implement it from the top down approach. So this needs to come from the bottom of the society. Next is about early diagnostic and intervention centers. So it can help in primary prevention of the manifestation of disability. So when the uh, disability is in the initial stage, so if we have proper diagnostic and intervention centers set up by the government, So that can be prevented in some cases, so that can be done. And also secondary prevention can be done, for example giving relief to those who are already identified as disabled, or so that the duration or severity of the disability can be reduced. So you can talk about this. Again, improving access to social protection. So I told you about the link between poverty and disability. So here social protection plays a very important role. So if the disabled people are properly given the social security initiatives, so I think that will help them in coming out of the cycle of poverty. So, in addition to disability specific social protection, PWDs should have access to other programs, including child and family allowances, unemployment benefits, and social assistance schemes. So, that is the way forward. I think, again, you could just go on, write three, four more points, but I don't think the word limit permits that. So, I just tried to restrict it to two, 3 points. These points could also be shortened. You just need to mention the broad point and then go on talking about these three, 4 lines in just one or two phrases. That could have been sufficient. So after that, we go on to conclude this answer. Again, in conclusion, you can just summarize your answer or give some example of things like DPSP or Sustainable Development Goals. So those are some good concluding points. So here I have mentioned about the constitutional articles of 14, 38, and 41. So in order to realize the goals of inclusive development, it is necessary that the Act is implemented in letter and spirit, as it also aligns with the constitutional objectives. So what all constitutional objectives? You must be knowing Article 14, so right to equality. So you need to be smart at using this article. So whenever such questions comes about vulnerable sections, even if you don't remember the particular DPSPs, you can always use Article 14, so which is about right to equality. Next is about 38, which is about India being a welfare state, and 41, which is specifically related to old age and disability related support. So this was the concluding statement, and I think you must have got the basic framework of the answer by now. So this should, if you could have written along these lines, I think that was a very good enough answer, and you should have got good marks for such an answer. Next, we will check out some of the answers that you have mentioned. If you have any doubts, you can ask in the chat box. Good evening, Saira. So let us move to Varsha's copy first. So the rights of persons with disabilities. Okay. So let us see what she has written in the introduction. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, implemented by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, focuses on ensuring that people with disabilities get a dignified life. They have access to education, healthcare, finance, and basic amenities of life. It covers physical disability, visual impairment, locomotor disability, hearing impairment, speech and language disability, intellectual disability. Okay, so you have listed down all of this. So I don't think it was necessary to list down all of this, but still let me check out whether you have excluded some important things. Caused due to chronic neurological conditions such as multiple. Okay, but in reality, this act is found to be a paper tiger, as there is a lack of sensitization towards persons with disabilities. Lack of sensitization. Okay, so I think what you could have done is instead of talking about so much about particular disabilities, you could have just mentioned the point that number of disabilities had have been increased. So I think what prevented you from writing this features of this act is the knowledge of that. So if you read about the PWD Act, I think that would be better for you, and you can just mention three, four features of that, and that should be good enough, rather than writing all these disabilities individually. Also, in the first part, you can just mention a data point. For example, you can talk about the number of disabled in India, 2% according to census 2011, and this part can also be shortened. Get a dignified life. They have access to education, healthcare. So all of this can be summarized by saying that the PWD Act empowers the disabled to have basic rights, or the government empowers the disabled through the PWD Act to give them their basic rights, and that should be sufficient. After that, go on to talk about the features of the act. Here, just one point is covered, and you are taking like 4 or 5 lines. So, in a 10 marker, that is a lot of space and words. So, try to include more dimensions whenever you are writing 4 or 5 lines. So, talk about reservations, talk about free education, talk about more number of disabilities. All of that can be written in this much space only. Next part is fine. You have written a good linking statement, and after that, you have moved on to talking about lack of sensitization of government. So let us see, the government hasn't implemented this in proper manner. So okay, you have mentioned it, it is fine, but here you can again give the example of states not notifying the rules. So that is an example of how government hasn't implemented this act. So those things will make your answer better. or I can say that that will differentiate your answers from the rest of the crowd. For example, everyone must have written that the government hasn't implemented this act in proper manner, because this is implied in the question itself. So try to differentiate a bit by including some uh, some tweaks in your answer. Next part is about special courts to be established for trying such offences haven't been set up. So this is good point. I think special courts have not been established. According to the study conducted by Disability Rights India Foundation, an NGO on implementation of rights of PwDs, it's okay. So this is also fine. Again, this can be mentioned in the first point also. State do not notify the rules. And here you can just talk about loopholes in reservations and mention this according to the study. Most of the infrastructural facilities like ramps, okay, so this is fine. Here you can use the keyword of accessible India. For example, nowhere in your answer till now accessible India is mentioned. So that also, if you are smart enough, using that keyword will show the examiner that you know about that scheme that is for disabled people. And you can just say that even after the notification of accessible India campaign, most of the infrastructural facilities don't have these facilities. So there are few government schools for children with disabilities. This is fine. There was no specific scheme. So this is also okay. COVID pandemic, this can also be included. This is a good point, I will say. Lack of sensitization of public towards PWDs. Okay, PWDs often stigmatized. This is okay. They are considered a financial burden for families. This is okay. They aren't considered deserving for marriage. Either they are treated politely or harshly. Seats reserved for them are generally occupied by public. They are rejected in private jobs. Okay, but I think this is too harsh criticism. You can just mention some of these points in an integrated manner, and go on to talk about more of the issues, uh, issues that are lacking in private sector. For example, you can talk about lack of facilities in the private sector. So here private jobs are fine. Instead of just saying that they are rejected, you can say there are no facilities for them. So that sounds a bit better. Still, this is fine. Like most of the points are connected and well written. But recently, the Department of Empowerment of Persons with Disabilities under the Ministry of Social okay to scrutinize government functioning has released 5 training modules for different categories of government officials. This training is to be undertaken at grassroots level community, senior officers and MPs. The Rehabilitation Council of India would be the nodal agency to coordinate training ways to sensitize people about disabilities. Okay, but I think again this part can be shortened. You have written a lot. Like the this examination does not test your capabilities in detail, or it does not test your capability to remember facts. So you without disabilities, showing films videos regarding PWDs, group discussion on barriers and solutions to PWDs. Okay, so here again, for example, you can see that when you are talking about ways to sensitize, you are just talking about the citizens. Most points are related to citizens. So if you can add about the training point here. Versa, sir, I couldn't hear. Which part did you miss, Versa? Can you just inform me? I'll just try to repeat what I told you. Next, we move to Anirudh's copy. Meanwhile, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 contains 21 types of disabilities which government can provide assistance and make affirmative actions for the welfare of the disabled government functionaries with no sensitization. Lacking implementation, most infrastructure in India like hospitals, shopping malls, in affirmative actions, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act provides certain reservation quota to people. Okay, political representation. Disabled people lack political representation of no sensitization to citizens. Discrimination, lack of awareness. Okay, Anirudh, I think basic broadly you have got the concept of the answer fine, but in the first part, just jumping before to the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, just try to give a background what is the status of disabled people in India and when this act was introduced and with what was the broad objective of this act. So that should be your introduction part, and after that you can just go on to talk about the issues with this act. But before that, again, you could just mention these features in 3 4 points where you can talk about 21 types of disabilities, and then free education to disabled children from 6 to 18 years of age, reservation to disabled people in both education and jobs. So those things you can talk about, implementation mechanism, and then you can go on to talk about functionaries with no sensitization. So since the question very clearly in the first part talks about right to persons with disabilities act, some amount of description of this act will be expected. So you just need to give 2 3 good points regarding to this act. After that you can talk about the issues. Government functioning with no sensitization. Again, the points are good, lacking implementation in affirmative actions. But try to include some examples here. Like in the first point, you can talk about uh, like states not notifying the rules regarding to disabled. In the next part, you can talk about uh, what are the loopholes in the reservation policy. So those things you can talk about. Rest of the like points are fine, and next part also it is good. Like discrimination, lack of awareness, these are good points. In way forward, preventive actions is okay. Kerala started comprehensive newborn screening to identify early disability warnings in newborns. In, in case of public awareness, governments, voluntary organizations to start campaigns and can utilize the social media effectively to sensitize people about vulnerability of the disabled. Here you can just talk about some of the training modules, or you can talk about bottom-up approach like destigmatization from the society. You can mention all of these things in the way forward. So I think again you just need to increase the dimensions of your answer, because in every point you are just mentioning 1 or 2 points, and that too you are going in very detail about explaining those points. So rather than explaining those points in such a detail, try to include more points and reduce your amount of explanation of each point. So by the effective implementation of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act and bringing sensitization to citizens at large can help you. So this is fine. Introduction is conclusion is pretty generic, and I think it is okay. Still, it will be okay with the examiner, but just try to include DPSP and SDG if you can. So that makes the conclusion better. So overall, you will get 3 out of 10 for this answer. The main issue being you have not talked about this act. Like at least 2 3 provisions of this act will be expected, and the introduction could also have been a bit better. Next, we move to Susma's copy. The Representative Act empowers persons with disabilities to right to equality and life with dignity. So this is fine. Again, some data point could have made this introduction better. Susma features act lays responsibility measures fine. Types of disabilities okay. Reservations are also fine. Disabled. So this is good. Like in very crisp manners, he has mentioned 3 4 points, and that should be good enough. Challenges, again, challenges could be divided according to what the question is asking. Rather than mentioning challenges, just mention that why this act is just on paper, or you can say that it is not implemented in letter and spirit, and then go on to expand the points that are given in the question itself. That will attract the examiner to your answer. Like that will make him understand that you are just attacking the point that has been asked. So rather than framing a subheading on more generic lines, try to frame it according to the question. And these points can only be adjusted there according to what challenges you are mentioning. For example, improper financing can be mentioned in the lack of sensitization on government's part. Disability being a social stigma can be mentioned in lack of sensitization on citizens' part. So you can just divide your points according to that. Way forward, societal awareness, providing education is fine, encouraging disabled friendly. So this is good. Way forward is fine. Therefore, the shortcomings of the RPWD Act needs to be addressed at the earliest. Although RPWD Act 2016 is a rights-based legislation, success of that okay. So conclusion is also good. So nice that you have used this term, rights-based legislation. Uh, this is also good uses of this term. So finally, conclusion is fine, and just one issue in this answer is that this challenges part could have been better. For example, both the parts that have been asked in the question could have been addressed individually. So overall you will get 3.5 out of 10 for this answer, Sushma. Next we move to Nisha's copy. Rights of persons with disabilities that empowers persons with disability to okay. Features are fine. Quantum of reservation, separate national and state fund, this is good. Types of disability has increased, okay. So this is fine. RPD Act just legal document due to some shortcoming, the lack of a customized infrastructure. Customized is fine. I think this you have spelled it wrong. Lack of policy implementation at grassroots, this is fine. Lack of sufficient data, face discrimination. So here try to include some examples. For example, you can talk about some of the loopholes in the reservation system, or you can talk about states not notifying the rules. So that are some good points. You can also mention that Supreme Court case if you remember it, or you can just talk about that the court held the government accountable for not being sensitive enough to give preference to disabled people in all India services. Next is about citizens insensitivity. This is fine. Stigmatization, retribution of past karma allegations. So okay, fine. C as financial burden, sensitization among citizens. The way forward is also good. Nice that you have used this smart art format. So this reduces the space that you are taking for answering. Awareness among citizens, policy implementation, tech-based skill training. Okay, rules and regulations, right, just becomes legal document for disabled persons if not implemented in letter and spirit. So this is also good. Conclusion is fine. Again, you could just mention some of the DPSP and SDGs, so that will make the answer a bit better. But overall, I think the presentation of answer is quite nice. Like you have included what needed in this answer. Structuring is very good. What you could have just done extra is like improved your points in this part, like government functionaries. This part could have been written a bit better. Like try to implement some of the points that uh, some other good copies contain. I'll post some of the good copies and try to implement some of those points. So that will make this section better. Otherwise, most of the answer is pretty fine. So overall, you will get 4 out of 10 for this answer, Nisha. So that will be it for today, guys. Next, Varsha, so last part of sensitization for government department citizens. Okay. So in your answer, I think again, I'll repeat the basic issues with your answer. In the first part, for example, you could have started with a data point, then gone on to talk about the introduction of PwD Act, and you could have just avoided writing all of this in such a way. You could have just cut off this education, healthcare, finance, and all of that, and just mentioned that the Act empowered was envisaged to empower basic rights to the disabled. And here also, after this, you instead of writing each and every disability, you can just mention 3 4 broad features of that. So that was the first part of the answer. And in the next part, this lack of sensitization on government is fine. This you have written well. Just what you could have done is given some more examples and reduced some of the points. For example, this COVID thing is very good. None of the guys have written this, so this is a very innovative point. A few government schools are also good. So overall, it is good. Just try to keep it more crisp. Citizens part is also fine. Like I have seen the answer, but again, in these last 3 4 points, you have written each point pretty separately. So you can just try to integrate 1 or 2 points. So that will just uh, help you to manage your answer better, like present your answer better. Otherwise, word limit will be an issue with this answer. And this part is not at all needed. For example, what you have talked about training modules and all, what you can do is just in the way forward, you can give a point regarding to training module and give this example that government has now started training for giving training to government officials. For example, all of your points in way forward talks about empowering the citizens or sensitizing the citizens. So if you talk about the training module here, it will also increase the dimensions of your way forward. So that will be better. And again, in the conclusion also, you can just shorten it. For example, this conclusion is more suitable for something like an essay. For example, examples of Deepa Malik, Stephen Hawking, Nick, these all things are not required at all. You can just talk about constitution because this paper is basically a generalist paper, and it wants you to address the question very crisply and to the point. So just try to remain in the word limit and address what is most required. Like don't go on explaining things in a lot of detail. So you can just talk about that the act should be implemented in letter and spirit and according to the constitutional provisions of right to equality and India's objective of being a welfare state and all. So you can mention those articles and that should be fine. So that was the overall answer, and I think I said that you will get 3.5 out of 10 for this answer, Varsha. So that should be it for today, guys. Next, we will again meet tomorrow with a new set of with a new question and again evaluation and feedback session in the evening. Meanwhile, again we will have that night owl discussions in the uh, night, which where we will talk about the current affairs and some of the prelim specific questions because prelims is also coming near. Also, I would like you to tell that if you want like personalized reviews and all, you can just join the CD Warzone Prime initiative, and that will help us also to give keep us motivated also and help us to address each of your issues personally. So that like many of you were yesterday complaining that some part of the answer is improving, some part is not improving. So if you feel like improving on a fast basis regarding to every part of your answer, you can just join that initiative, and we'll make sure that we contact you and keep you in the loop regarding each and every answer. So, thank you for today, guys, and again, we will meet tomorrow. So, that is it for today's session.